with that, let me introduce John Sallak.
Thank you. I'm writing a book on 97 ways to unretire from the trucking industry. Some of us just never learn, do we? But I don't know of a better place I'd rather be today than hanging out with a bunch of truckers. I get to kind of lay the groundwork maybe for what we'll do all day today, but it's a little bit of an awareness startup on some things that have happened in the last year or so, things that are going on now in federal, state regulations, and some things that have been backed off of. Maybe we won't be following certain rules that you've been expecting. So I'd like to go through some of these, but in order to maybe make it a little clearer for some of you, I don't know if they even teach civics or social studies or anything under that name in school anymore, but 100 years ago when I was in school, we had to study civics. Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting still to me, now that being in the industry, there's a little bit of a difference between rules and laws. A little difference between regulations and statute. So I'd like to tell you, this is my 25-cent civics lesson here, because we'll be talking about a little bit of both today. We have laws. We're a nation of laws, and we live by those laws after they've been passed and signed off. Well, they are born, they begin usually in the House of Representatives or maybe in the Senate, and an idea comes along and then a bill is introduced. Now, if this bill is successful in making it through all of the steps and the hurdles that it has to encounter, it can become a law or a statute. It goes into the U.S. Code. So the House might hear this bill with one of their committees, and then maybe another committee, and then the entire House votes because it's continuing to get positive votes. Now it goes from the House to the Senate, and the same thing, some committee activity going on. If the committees continue to move it, it becomes a bill that can be offered to the president for a signature. Now the same process can happen in every state, and the executive would be the governor. So once we've reached that point and we have something that has been voted on through both houses, the president signs it and it becomes law. And now it's enforceable by civil or criminal penalties. So that's how we get laws. But we also have a system of adopting rules and regulations in this country. And once again, the states can do the same thing. They have the same structure. But they come to us a little bit differently. There are about 50 departments of federal government. Every one of them has their own rule-making ability. They have their own title where the rules go. So an idea for a regulation may come from industry, it may come from the agency, who knows where it comes from, but then it comes to the agency, they look it over and they think it's worthwhile, and they'll publish it for comment. So when it's published for comment, you may have 60 days as a citizen. Every one of you can comment on any rule that ever comes out in the Federal Register, any proposed rule. That's our right as citizens. Now, will someone pay any attention to John Sallak's name on something? Maybe not. But they'll certainly pay attention to it if there's 10,000 other people with their names on it, or a large organization, someone with some authority and some power, which leads us back to what Dave started with here, and that's that there's so much value, and I watched it over the years with the Trucking Association, so much value in having that voice from whatever state in which you operate, and we've got two pretty good ones here with Oregon and Washington, these groups. So anyway, now there's a comment period. Everybody comments. That agency who started the process is now looking at the comments and making a decision. Should we proceed? If they proceed, they can bring this to a point where it will be republished as a proposed rule, a final rule, and when it becomes a final rule with an effective date, we live with it in our industry. Now our industry, primarily, we're affected by a lot of different agencies, a lot of different departments, but primarily we're looking at the Department of Transportation, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And I've got a couple that I want to mention to you today, but what we're talking about today are things that have gone through that process with the rulemaking. We may also refer to something that has happened through the lawmaking procedure. And I don't know that we've ever been in a more active, more interesting political scenario than we are today in this country. And we're seeing a lot of activity going on in Congress. We're seeing it going on with rulemaking. And so that's how we get to that. There is a little difference between regulations and laws. And Oregon has their own rulemaking ability. We've gone through it before through the Trucking Association. There are some regulations on the Oregon books today that are there because the association was able to support it with the support of its members and with the industry. So with that, we'll talk about some of these things. First one, a word that just brings joy to a lot of your hearts, I think, is obstructive sleep apnea. Now, we've been talking about this for a long time. There's been a proposed rule. National Transportation Safety Board recommended a higher degree of testing. There was a lot of industry pushback. There are a lot of issues here that concern us in the trucking industry. And I'd like to talk very briefly in a second here about just my own personal opinion for whatever that might be worth. However, in August of 2017, the regulators pulled the plan to test truckers and train operators for sleep apnea. This is now on the back burner, but not completely dead. This is a process that started as a proposed rulemaking. A lot of time for comment. They extended the comment period. Thousands of people, organizations had comments about sleep apnea. The current administration has decided that this is not something that should be pursued at this time. So this is now, as it says, on the back burner. What I'd encourage you to consider, and I'll try and be quick with my little two-cent editorial here, don't relax because we don't have an active rulemaking going on. I personally believe, sleep apnea is a deadly problem in our industry. And if you look at the science and the people who might really struggle with sleep apnea, quite often there's a high-risk group. And that high-risk group is middle-aged to older males, slightly overweight. Other issues that might involve the airway, a deviated septum, a larger neck size, protruding jawline. All of these have to do with the fact that the airway may be affected when the driver's trying to sleep. Now, what happens is if you don't get proper sleep, the apnea will cause you to never reach your deepest level that you need, REM level sleep. You have to get there. We have to cycle through there 3 or 4 times during every sleep period. If we don't leave the shallow area of sleep, we've never rested, but we don't know it. We wake up, we've done our 8 hours in the sleeper, we've done 10 hours, we've done whatever, and we think we're ready to go. And then we get out there and we go, and we can't stay awake, and we can't understand why. And most of us will try and just push through that. A few years ago, the DOT announced, the federal DOT said that over 500 truck drivers had died in crashes in 1 calendar year. About 400 of them, about 80% of those drivers perished in a single vehicle off the road crash. We don't know why. We can guess why. And fatigue has to be part of it. And sometimes when you look at the way we push and the stress level for a truck driver, the schedules to keep, the speeds to maintain, and all of these things to do, we've got someone who will push through rather than take a 15 or 30-minute nap when they really needed it. So is apnea a problem? I truly believe it is. My son's a truck driver and he's had a CPAP for about 8 years. He won't go anywhere without it. We went elk hunting or deer hunting last year. Doesn't matter what I call him, I never shoot one anyway, but I get a safety award from him every year. But we were out there and he's setting up this big old tent, and we've got the wood stove, we got all the cool stuff. And here he brings this little generator along. I said, what on earth do we need electricity for up here? The CPAP. He will not go anywhere without it because that's how he gets his rest and he knows he needs it. We have people in our industry struggling and suffering with apnea, and we need to address that, and we need to be aware of it. The downside of all this is that if you're operating a sleep clinic or if you're selling CPAPs, it's pretty easy to diagnose a sleep problem. So please be aware of that. There's a real push on this from a supposed safety issue, and it is a safety issue, but it's pretty easy also to fall into that area where maybe you didn't need the treatment for apnea, but you're there. And if you think in the terms of our population in our trucking industry today, we've got folks at high risk. Now, they're not all big guys. I'm married to a woman, been married to her for 56 years, who's 5'5", and she weighs about 120 pounds, and she's had apnea and a CPAP for 8 or 9 years. And that's how she gets sleep. It can affect any of us, so be aware of that. I'm the only one that doesn't have one. Sleep like a baby. Okay, that's enough on this. Now, there are also going to be experts in the room throughout the day. If you've got issues about the sleep apnea thing, CPAP thing, talk to people. The speed limiter rule, August of 16, Federal Motor Carrier and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration proposed speed limiters for trucks. And they had a rule, actually, and it was written, but nobody could decide on the speed, 60, 65, 68. If we asked in this room, we might get 10 different answers on what might be reasonable. The industry's been pushing hard against it. In July of 1917, the speed limiter rule fell off the short-term agendas according to the Office of Management and Budget, according to the current administration. This is a regulation, and the president had the authority, the administration had the authority to stop it. So it's now on the back burner, the speed limiter issues. You may still hear things about it, but it is on the back burner. Greenhouse gas emissions, and Dave touched on these. Phase 2 requires manufacturers to further reduce emissions, would also have capped how many glider manufacturers could produce in a year, which would raise the cost of trucks significantly. Well, that went on to invoke a comment request, and they got over 24,000 comments about this effort that would repeal the use of glider kits. And so that's still in the works. Nothing final has been done there. California's still doing its own thing. They're not going to back off. They're not going to let up. Oregon and Washington tend to be quite sympathetic and quite enamored with some of the California rules. This is a place where individually we probably cannot accomplish very much. This is where we need to have a strong group effort working for us and watching this. Sometimes what our associations are doing are simply watching to be able to come back to the membership and say, here's what they're going to do. How do you feel about it? How do you want us to represent you? So this is so important for you to be a part of this. The URS, Unified Registration System, Phase 1 is launched. That was just for new entries. And what this is eventually going to replace the SAFER system. Right now, all of you, almost everybody in the room, is probably every 2 years having to update the data on these SAFER records. So this will eventually replace it, the Unified Registration System. Unified Carrier Registration. Now this is something we've had all along. No major changes here, except we had some delay in the establishment of the fees for UCR. The establishment now has been done. The fees have been set as of January 5, and you should be going ahead and registering and paying the fees. They've been reduced by 9%. This is kind of unusual to see something drop down, but they've been overcharging us. The question might come up, can we get back the money we overpaid? I have no idea, but I suspect the answer is no. If somebody here knows that, we should know how to go after that. That may be something the association should be looking at. I don't know if we can recapture overpayments or not. A term called safety fitness determination. This was published over a year ago, and it would have updated the current system of rating. And for years we've lived with a safety rating system where our company, based on an audit from Federal Motor Carrier or an agent representing Federal Motor Carrier, we would receive a compliance review or an audit. If we've done well, we'll get a satisfactory rating. If there are some issues, we may have a conditional rating, and if there are serious issues, we could get an unsatisfactory. Unsatisfactory would bring with it a 45-day or a 60-day shutdown, depending on whether or not you carry hazardous materials. Well, the SFD rulemaking proposal was to just simplify it. You either pass or you're unfit. And unfit meant you cease operations. Pretty draconian way of dealing with the rule. It would produce a safety score, and then if it wasn't good enough, it'd be unfit. They would work through what we're using now, the CSA roadside inspections and crashes. In March of 17, Federal Motor Carrier withdrew the proposal. They said if changes are needed in the future, a new rulemaking will be initiated that will incorporate recommendations from National Academies of Science. NAS is the top group who can actually come up with good information based on scientific studies. So that's where we are. Once again, we've seen the administration pulling something back that may or may not have been detrimental to our industry. going on with it, in July, the NIS study recommended replacing the current systems with something called item response theory. In order for me to really sound smart in front of all of you this morning, I went online because I know how to Google. My grandchildren have taught me some things. And I studied item response theory, and I still have no idea what the heck I'm talking about. It's a scientific process of using data and coming up with better results than what we think we have today. Federal Motor Carrier is in the process of finalizing a plan for CSA for submission to Congress, because they've been told, look at this program and see if you can do anything to make it better. The modeling won't come out until winter of this year, summer of next year, and the fate of the safety fitness determination rule will be linked to changes in the CSA. Now, a couple of things in real life that they're talking about here, and I think some of you have suffered through this. The process for determining your score in the accident factor in CSA is based on miles and number of accidents, and it doesn't take preventability into account. The only time preventability can even be discussed is after the audit's over and you've failed the accident factor. Well, the issue for years, and the industry has fought this, is that preventability should be an issue. Why should we even have these crashes on our record when it's so obvious, there's compelling evidence that it was not something our driver could have avoided? That's one of the issues they're working on. They're working on the schedule of how peer groups are established and how scores are established in those peer groups in order to determine where we are with a safety rating and whether or not an alert will appear on our record, on our profile. Now, about a year and a half ago, it was discovered that these profiles were, there's too much available to the public about alerts and percentages and those kinds of things, so a lot of that material was removed from the CSA website. It's not available now unless you have the PIN, the portal entry, to be able to take a look at your records. But that's ongoing. Oregon law, one that was kind of big that came out last year, it's the ban the box. You can't have any reference of convictions or incarceration on the job application. You cannot ask that question. Can't ask when they're filling out the application for employment. You can't ask previous salary questions. So, when can you ask? Or can you ever ask? I don't know. I suspect you can make these requests for information after the job offer. But I'm certainly not an HR specialist, and I think that's a question that maybe someone today, during our musings here, someone could answer that for us. The mandatory sick leave law, and we've had that for a while now, and if you've got, I believe if you've got 10 or more employees, then you've got an obligation to let them accrue up to 40 hours of paid sick leave in a year. And I think for the city of Portland, it's 6 or more. But that's out there, it's going on, and you may be subject to it. You should be part of it right now. The new distracted driving law, this is a huge step, and I think we have someone from the State Police who's going to discuss it later in the morning with us. Glowstone has taken some steps to address it in advance, which may be helpful somewhere down the line to you. As you'll learn, there is a provision in the rule where training can be used to avoid paying the fine for a first-time offender, and there will be more information on that later. Slow down, move over law. This is kind of tricky. We've had it for several years. If it's an emergency vehicle, you do need to slow down, or you need to move to the adjoining lane to give that emergency vehicle and its operator some safe space in which to operate. We've seen some horrible crashes, lost law enforcement people because they were simply trying to do their job and the other driver was not. Not necessarily a commercial driver, but the other person in another vehicle has caused this horrible maiming or deadly crash. This is so important, but I think you need to be spending time with your drivers to make sure they understand it. There's a little bit of a trap in here because quite often we have a rule that says we can't use the other lane. We can't go to the left lane because of the fact that we're driving a commercial vehicle. We got a situation in Washington where the driver actually moved over. He didn't have the law behind him, but he did see a woman in a car, disabled, and she was on the shoulder, so he moved over. His timing was unfortunate. As he moved over, he went by the scale. Well, the scale was closed. He could see that, but they were opening it. The officer was there, and they stopped him and brought him in and cited him for failing to stay in that lane, and in their opinion, trying to avoid the scale. Unbelievable timing, just coincidental timing. But be aware of that. This slow down, move over law is going to affect all of traffic now. It's not just emergency vehicles. Some agenda items from Congress. They're looking to establish federal standards for rest breaks and meal breaks. This is huge. I think Walmart was assessed, I don't know if it's ever been paid, $60 million in a case filed in California because drivers were not being paid for time spent in the sleeper or taking other rest breaks. The states are establishing their own mandate for rest breaks, for meal breaks. We've got a federal mandate that we have to follow. So where do we fit? When do we tell our driver to take this rest break? And I'm a believer in rest breaks if the driver can take it at a time that's appropriate where it does some good. But we've got now a rest break from this state that says you got to stop in 4 hours. They've got another one that says, well, you stop every 5 hours, every 6 hours. You got to do this, you got to do that. And the feds are saying at the 8th hour, if you're going to continue to drive, you need to be taking 30 minutes off. Maybe they've just finished another mandated break. You see the problems and the trap that we can fall into in a class action suit. And there's more activity going on there. Something to really pay attention to. Efforts are underway to clear the regulatory roadblocks to autonomous vehicles. Just try and open the door for more studies of self-driving vehicles. The U.S. House has introduced a bill that would allow an 18-year-old CDL driver to operate in interstate commerce. For years, it's been 21. However, almost every state, maybe every state, allows an 18-year-old to drive in a commercial vehicle. An 18-year-old can drive within the state of Oregon. They cannot go to Vancouver. They can drive all over Oregon from Ontario, but they can't go to Idaho legally. Now, I don't know the right answer to this, and we've talked for years about it, and there are a lot of players here. The insurance industry has something to say about this. We've got a desperate need for truck drivers. Some of you know drivers at 18 who are probably as good as the guys who are 50 years old. You get somebody that grew up on a farm, they may be the hardest worker you've got, and they're good drivers. All you got to do is figure out how to slow them down and stay out of trouble. But we've got drivers at 18 that are probably the best around, and we've got some that should never be in a truck. How do we sort that out? It's something that's coming. There's a bill in Congress. Now, this isn't rulemaking. This is statute. Congress has introduced a bill in the House. And we don't know where it'll go, but it's worth following and tracking. And once again, somewhere down the line, we may, as an association in Oregon or Washington, we may have something pretty important to say about this rule. So it's one that I think you should be watching. What else is FMCSA up to? They're studying truck drivers' commuting habits and the safety impact. And this came from I believe it was the Walmart episode back east. A driver had commuted some distance. He had gone 30 some hours, as I understand, without sleep. He rear-ended a vehicle that had a couple of celebrities. There was a fatality and quite a settlement going on, I guess. So now there's a study going on the effect of commuting for truck drivers. Now, for some time, we've had what's now called personal use of a commercial vehicle. It's been in a written interpretation in the federal regs. And now it's becoming more clear what a personal use can be, because we will, in the ELD, which you'll be learning later, in the ELD system, you can actually have a code for personal conveyance. There are some restrictions. So how far are we willing to let our drivers go under personal conveyance? Something you should all be thinking about. Maybe you've got a policy now, but you should be trying to decide how much will we allow in the interest of safety. Can a driver operate and go 10 hours just to show up for work and then get in the truck and have 11 to drive? We've got to be aware of that. Fixing the certified medical registry, examiner's registry to restore full services. The CME registry, the national registry, was hacked a while back. It hasn't been unhacked. They haven't fixed it. So right now you can't go and obtain online, you can't obtain proof that your driver was medically examined by someone from the registry. Be very careful of that. Do what you can to learn. You can always call that medical examiner. You'll have their 10-digit number, but don't let it just go by the wayside. because it's not available on that website yet. We still have an obligation to try and determine and confirm that our driver was examined by someone who's authorized to do the exam. An agency priority is to encourage technological innovation in trucking. There's a woman named Kathy Gautreau, I believe, who's now the assistant deputy in Federal Motor Carrier. She was the head of the Louisiana Trucking Association for 20 or 30 years, and now she's in a pretty high-ranking position. Recently made the statement, we're going to do everything possible to open the door for more and more studies of advancing technology in the trucking industry, things that we should be following. The IRP, IFTA International Fuel Tax Agreement, no major changes. There's some concern about the limited feature of the ELDs using IFTA and IRP for record keeping, and I can't go into those details because I don't understand them, but you'll certainly get them later in the morning. It's an issue that's being dealt with today, and it's a problem with what ELD can do today and what the federal mandate was as far as record keeping. Electronic credentials are coming. That's it. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to try and answer them, but I suspect an awful lot of what I've touched on here, you'll be able to get more information as we go on. I commend all of you for being here. For me, it's just a treat. I've been in this industry since I was 18 years old, and it's appearing that I don't ever want to leave completely, and it's because I don't know of any better people to hang out with than truckers. And there's quite a group of them in here, some old friends that I've known for years. A lot of people who I don't think they're 21 yet. I don't know how they got in the door. They look so young to me.